The blood on her dress told half the story, but the bruise blooming purple across her cheekbone told the rest. And Jackson Xavier knew right then that some men deserved worse than hanging. He had ridden into Deadwood, South Dakota, that afternoon with nothing but his horse, his rifle, and the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from 3 years of running cattle, drives from Texas to Montana. The year was 1878, and Deadwood still carried the wild energy of a gold rush town that refused to settle down, even though the easy gold was mostly gone. Jackson had come looking for work, maybe a hot meal, and a place to sleep that did not involve the hard ground and an endless sky. What he had not come looking for was a woman with terror in her eyes and nowhere left to run. He had been walking past the general store, leading his roan mare toward the livery, when he heard it. A sound so soft he almost missed it beneath the noise of the street, the piano music spilling from the saloons, the shouts of miners and the rattle of wagon wheels. But Jackson had spent enough time in quiet places to recognize the sound of someone trying very hard not to make any noise at all. The sound of someone crying while holding their breath, hoping the world would not notice their breaking. He found her behind the general store, wedged between the back wall and a stack of empty crates that smelled like salt pork and coffee beans. She had made herself as small as possible, knees drawn up to her chest, face buried in her arms. Her dress had once been a nice calico print, blue flowers on cream fabric, but now it was torn at the shoulder and stained dark in places that made Jackson's jaw tighten. Her hair, a rich brown that caught reddish highlights in the late afternoon sun, had come loose from its pins and hung in tangled waves around her face. She did not hear him approach at first. Jackson was good at moving quietly when he needed to, a skill learned from years of night watches and predators, both animal and human. But he made a point of scuffing his boot against the dirt because the last thing she needed was another man sneaking up on her. Her head snapped up, and Jackson got his first clear look at her face. She could not have been more than 22 or 23, with features that would have been pretty if they were not currently marked by violence and fear. Her eyes were hazel, more green than brown in the slanting light, and they went wide with panic when she saw him. She scrambled backward, pressing herself harder against the wall, and Jackson saw her hand move toward a small pocket in her skirt. "Easy," he said, keeping his voice low and steady, the same tone he used with spooked horses. "I am not here to hurt you." She stared at him, her breathing quick and shallow, her whole body trembling. Up close, he could see that the blood on her dress came from a split on her lower lip and maybe from her nose, which looked swollen. The bruise on her cheek was fresh, maybe an hour old, still darkening. "Who did this to you?" Jackson asked, though he had a pretty good idea. In his experience, there were only a few kinds of men who left marks like that on a woman. She shook her head, not answering, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. She wiped at them angrily with the back of her hand, as if furious at herself for crying. Jackson glanced back toward the street, then looked at her again. He was not the kind of man who walked away from trouble, never had been, but he also knew that sometimes the best help you could offer was the kind that got someone out of a bad situation entirely. He had money saved, enough to get by for a while. He had no ties keeping him in Deadwood or anywhere else, and he had always been too quick to act when he saw someone hurting. "Listen to me," he said, crouching down so he was closer to her eye level, being careful to stay far enough back that she would not feel trapped. "I do not know your story, and you do not have to tell me if you do not want to, but I can see that you are in trouble, and I can see that you are scared. So here is what I am offering. Cry your last tear, then come with me." She blinked at him, confusion cutting through the fear for just a moment. "What? Cry your last tear," Jackson repeated, Get it out, all that pain and fear and whatever else is churning inside you, and then come with me. I have a horse, I have supplies, and I have no reason to stay in this town. You want out of whatever situation put those marks on you. I will get you out. I do not even know you, she whispered, and her voice was rough, like she had been screaming before the crying. No, you do not, Jackson agreed. My name is Jackson Xavier. I am a drover, been working cattle for the last 8 years since I was 17. I am not rich, but I am honest. I have never hit a woman in my life, and I do not plan to start. And right now, I am the best chance you have got at getting away from whoever did that to your face. She studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face like she was trying to read his soul. Jackson let her look. He had nothing to hide. His face was weathered from sun and wind, lined at the corners of his eyes from squinting at horizons. He had dark hair that needed cutting and a few days of stubble on his jaw. He was tall and broad-shouldered from hard work, and he supposed he looked rough, but he hoped she could see past that to the truth underneath. "Why would you help me?" she asked finally. "You do not know me either. Why would you risk getting involved?" "Because somebody should," Jackson said simply, "and I happen to be here." She let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "You have no idea what you would be getting into. Then tell me." She was quiet for so long that Jackson thought she might not answer. Behind them, the sounds of Deadwood continued, oblivious. Somewhere a dog barked. A woman called out to someone named Charlie. The stamp mill at one of the mines created a steady rhythmic thunder in the distance. "My name is Maggie Lawson," she said finally, and her voice was steadier now, like making the decision to speak had given her something to hold on to. "Most people call me Maggie. I came to Deadwood 6 months ago with my father. He had heard there was still gold to be found, that a smart man with a good claim could make his fortune. We sold everything we had back in Illinois to come here." Jackson waited, patient. "He died 3 months ago," Maggie continued, and her voice cracked on the words. "Cave in at the mine. They pulled him out, but he was already gone. Suddenly I had no money, no family, no way to get home, and then Richard Salter offered to help me." The way she said the name made Jackson's hands curl into fists. "Let me guess. His help came with conditions." "He said he would take care of me," Maggie said, and now the words were spilling out faster, like a dam breaking. "He owns the biggest saloon in town, has money, has influence. He said I could work for him, serving drinks, nothing improper. He said I could stay in a room above the saloon, that he would make sure I was safe. And I was so desperate, so scared, I said yes." "But it was not just serving drinks," Jackson said. "At first it was," Maggie said. "For a few weeks it really was just that. He was polite, almost courteous. But then he started making comments, saying things about how a woman like me should not be alone, how he could offer me more than just a job. When I refused him, when I made it clear I was not interested, he started getting angry. And today—" She trailed off, touching her cheek gingerly. "Today he decided to take what you were not offering," Jackson finished, his voice hard. Maggie nodded. "I fought him. I managed to get away, but he said if I try to leave town, he will make sure everyone knows I am a thief, that I stole from him. He has the sheriff in his pocket. No one will believe me over him, and if I stay, he will just come for me again. I have nowhere to go." Jackson was quiet for a moment, thinking. Richard Salter. He had heard the name since arriving in town, had seen the big saloon with Salter's name painted in gold letters above the door. A man like that would not take kindly to having his property, as he probably thought of Maggie, stolen away. But Jackson had faced down stampeding cattle, wolves, and drought. He was not about to be scared off by a saloon owner with delusions of power. "Here is what we are going to do," Jackson said, his mind already working through the logistics. It is getting on toward evening. In about an hour it will be full dark. You are going to stay here out of sight. I am going to go collect my horse from the livery, get us some supplies, and then I am coming back for you. We will ride out after dark, head south toward the Cheyenne River, and then cut west. By the time Salter realizes you are gone, we will be far enough away that it will not matter. He will come after us, Maggie said, fear sharp in her voice. Maybe, Jackson acknowledged. But I know how to cover a trail and I know how to move fast, and if he does catch up, I am a pretty fair hand with a rifle. I cannot ask you to fight for me. I cannot ask you to risk your life. You are not asking, Jackson said. I am offering. There is a difference. He stood up, his knees creaking slightly from the crouch. Now you think you can stay hidden for an hour. Stay quiet, stay out of sight, Maggie nodded, wiping at her face again. The tears had stopped, and Jackson could see something else in her eyes now. Not just fear, but a fragile, desperate hope. Cry your last tear, Jackson said again, and this time there was something almost gentle in his rough voice. Because once we ride out of here, you are done with crying. You are done with being scared. You are starting over, and I promise you, I will do everything in my power to make sure you get that chance. Why? She asked again, and this time the question sounded different. Less suspicious, more wondering. Jackson thought about it, trying to find words for something he did not fully understand himself. Maybe it was because he had grown up watching his mother suffer under his father's fists, until the day she finally had the courage to take Jackson and his sister and run. Maybe it was because he believed, deep in his bones, that the measure of a man was not in how much gold he could dig out of the ground, but in what he did when someone needed help. Or maybe it was something simpler and more immediate. Maybe it was because when he looked at Maggie Lawson, with her hazel eyes and her split lip and her fierce, desperate courage, he saw someone worth saving. Because it is the right thing to do, he said finally, and because I think you deserve better than what this town has given you. He left her there, tucked behind the crates, and made his way back to the street. The sun was sinking behind the hills now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Deadwood was coming alive in the way that frontier towns did when darkness fell, the saloons filling up with men looking to spend their hard-earned pay on liquor and cards and women. Jackson moved through the crowds with purpose, keeping his head down and his hat pulled low. The livery was run by an older man with a tobacco-stained beard who barely looked up when Jackson paid to collect his horse. The roan mare, a sturdy animal named Rosie who had carried him thousands of miles, nickered softly when she saw him, and Jackson took a moment to stroke her neck. "Going to need you to run tonight, girl," he murmured. "Think you have got it in you?" Rosie tossed her head as if insulted by the question, and Jackson allowed himself a small smile. He saddled her quickly, his hands moving through the familiar motions, checking the cinch, making sure everything was secure. Then he led her out into the street and toward the general store. It was still open, light spilling out through the windows. Jackson tied Rosie to the rail and went inside. The store smelled like leather and tobacco and dried beans, all the scents of frontier commerce. A thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles stood behind the counter, and he nodded at Jackson. "Help you with something?" "Need to stock up for some travel," Jackson said. "Jerky, hardtack, coffee, couple canteens, and a bedroll if you have got one to spare." The man nodded and started gathering items. "Heading out of town, thinking about it," Jackson said, keeping his tone casual. "Heard there might be work down south." It was a lie, but a believable one. Men came and went from Deadwood all the time, chasing rumors of gold or work or just trying to outrun their pasts. Nobody questioned it. Jackson paid for the supplies, loaded them onto Rosie, and then made one more stop at a small boarding house where he had been planning to rent a room for the night. Instead, he paid for a week in advance and collected the saddle bags he had left there earlier. Inside them were his spare clothes, his shaving kit, and the small leather pouch that held his savings. Not a fortune, but enough to get by for a while. The sky was fully dark by the time he made his way back to the alley behind the general store, leading Rosie carefully through the shadows. Maggie was right where he had left her, but she had pulled herself together in the intervening hour. Her hair was pinned back up, though not as neatly as before, and she had wiped the blood from her face. The bruise was worse now, purple and angry, but her eyes were clear. "You came back," she said, and there was something in her voice that suggested she had not been entirely sure he would. "Told you I would," Jackson said. He untied his spare bedroll from behind the saddle and handed it to her. "It is going to be a long ride. You ever ridden a horse before?" "A little," Maggie said. "My father had a farm horse back in Illinois. I rode her sometimes." "Good enough," Jackson said. He swung up into the saddle and then reached down to offer her his hand. "You are going to ride with me. Foot in the stirrup, grab my hand, and I will pull you up." Maggie hesitated for just a moment, and Jackson saw the fear flicker across her face again. She was about to trust her life to a stranger, to climb onto a horse in the dark and ride away from everything she knew. It was terrifying, Jackson realized. But she was going to do it anyway because the alternative was worse. She took his hand. Her palm was small and rough against his, the hand of someone who had worked hard. Jackson pulled, and Maggie scrambled up, settling behind him on Rosie's broad back. She wrapped her arms around his waist, holding on tight, and Jackson felt the tremor that ran through her. "Hold on," he said quietly. "We are going to start slow, make sure we do not attract attention. Once we are clear of town, we will move faster." He urged Rosie forward, and the horse moved smoothly into the darkness between buildings. Jackson knew Deadwood well enough from his afternoon reconnaissance to find his way through the back streets, avoiding the main thoroughfares where the crowds would take notice of a man riding double. They passed behind the stamp mill, skirted the edge of the Chinese quarter where lanterns glowed in windows, and the smell of unfamiliar spices filled the air, and finally reached the southern edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open country. Only then did Jackson let Rosie stretch into a faster pace, a ground-eating trot that would carry them miles before the horse needed rest. Behind him, Maggie held on, her face pressed against his back, and Jackson could feel each breath she took, quick and frightened but determined. They rode through the night, following the rough trail south by the light of a half-moon, and the stars that scattered across the sky like thrown diamonds. Jackson kept them moving steadily, stopping every few hours to let Rosie rest and drink from the streams they crossed. During those stops, Maggie would climb down, stretch her legs, and avoid looking at him directly, as if she still was not quite sure what to make of her rescuer. Dawn found them 20 miles south of Deadwood, in a landscape of rolling hills covered in long grass that whispered in the wind. Jackson finally called a longer halt, guiding Rosie off the trail and into a small grove of cottonwood trees near a creek. The trees would hide their fire if they were careful. Maggie slid down from the horse with a groan, her legs clearly stiff from the long ride. Jackson followed, his own muscles protesting after hours in the saddle, and set about unsaddling Rosie and making camp. "How far have we come?" Maggie asked, her voice hoarse from the cold night air. 20 miles, give or take," Jackson said, loosening the cinch and pulling the saddle free. "Another 30 miles and we will cross into Wyoming territory. After that, we will be harder to track." Maggie nodded, rubbing her arms against the morning chill. The sun was just starting to paint the eastern sky in shades of gold and pink, but the air still held the cool bite of night. Jackson pulled a blanket from his bedroll and handed it to her. "Wrap up," he said. "I will get a fire going, make some coffee. You must be frozen." "Thank you," Maggie said quietly, and when Jackson glanced at her, he saw that her eyes were wet again. "I thought you were done crying," he said, but his tone was gentle, almost teasing. "These are different tears," Maggie said, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. "These are grateful tears. I still cannot believe you did this. You do not even know me." "I am getting to know you," Jackson pointed out, gathering small sticks and dry grass for kindling. "For instance, I know you are braver than you give yourself credit for. Not many people would have the courage to run the way you just did." "I did not run," Maggie said. "You carried me." "You made the choice to come," Jackson corrected, striking a spark with his flint and steel, coaxing it into a small flame. "That took courage. You could have stayed, told yourself it was not that bad, convinced yourself that Salter would leave you alone if you just did what he wanted. A lot of people make that choice. You did not." Maggie was quiet, watching the fire grow under Jackson's careful tending. When it was burning steady, he filled his battered coffee pot with water from the creek and set it over the flames. The smell of coffee brewing was one of the great comforts of life on the trail, Jackson had always thought. Something warm and familiar in a world that was often cold and strange. "What happens now?" Maggie asked after a while. "Where are we going?" Jackson had been thinking about that question all night. "Depends," he said. "Do you have family anywhere? Anyone you could go to?" Maggie shook her head. "My mother died when I was young. My father was all I had and he is gone. There is an aunt in Illinois, but I barely know her, and I have no money to get there even if I wanted to. Friends? None that could help. The few people I knew in Deadwood all work for Salter in one way or another." Jackson poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed one to Maggie. She wrapped her hands around it, soaking in the warmth. "Then I guess the question is, what do you want to do? Where do you want to go?" "I do not know," Maggie admitted. "I have been so focused on just surviving day to day that I have not thought beyond that." "Well, you have got time to think now," Jackson said. He took a sip of his coffee, strong and bitter and perfect. "Here is what I am thinking. We keep heading west into Wyoming territory. There are towns out there, places where we can find work. I can always hire on as a ranch hand or a drover. You could find work too, maybe as a cook or a housekeeper for one of the ranchers. Build up some money, figure out what you want next." Maggie asked, and there was something careful in her voice. Jackson met her eyes. "Unless you would rather go your own way once we reach safety." "I would understand that. But if you are willing, I figure we could help each other for a while. You need protection and a way to make a living. I could use someone to help with camp, cooking, that sort of thing on the trail. It would be a partnership, nothing more unless you want it otherwise. Separate bedrolls, separate spaces. I am not Salter. I am not going to demand anything from you." Maggie studied him over the rim of her coffee cup, and Jackson could almost see her mind working, weighing options, trying to decide if she could trust him. He did not blame her for being cautious. She had every reason to be suspicious of men making offers. "You have been nothing but kind to me," Maggie said slowly. "And I appreciate that more than I can say. But you have to understand, after what happened with Salter, after what I have seen in Deadwood, it is hard for me to believe that any man would help without expecting something in return." "I understand," Jackson said, "and I cannot prove my intentions except by my actions. So how about this? We travel together, at least until we reach a town where you feel safe. Along the way, you can decide whether you trust me. If you do, we continue on as partners. If you do not, I will make sure you have enough money to get by on your own and we part ways as friends. Does that sound fair?" Maggie thought about it, then nodded slowly. "That sounds fair. They finished their coffee in silence, and Jackson fried up some salt pork and hardtack for breakfast. It was not fancy, but it was filling, and Maggie ate like she had not had a proper meal in days, which she probably had not. After they ate, Jackson let her rest while he scouted their back trail, making sure there were no signs of pursuit. The landscape was empty, nothing but grass and sky and the distant shapes of the black hills behind them. If Salter had sent men after them, they were not close yet. Jackson returned to camp, where Maggie had fallen asleep wrapped in the blanket, her face finally peaceful. He watched her for a moment, taking in the way the morning light caught in her hair, the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. She was pretty, even with the bruises, but it was more than that. There was something about her that called to something in him, something he had not felt in a long time. Jackson shook his head, trying to clear the thought. Now was not the time for that. Right now, Maggie needed a protector, not a suitor. He could examine his own feelings later. They rested until midday, then mounted up again and continued west. The landscape gradually changed as they left the Black Hills region behind, becoming drier and more open. They passed occasional homesteads, small cabins with corrals and gardens, but Jackson kept them at a distance, not wanting to be remembered. At night, they made cold camps, no fires that could be seen from afar, and Jackson taught Maggie how to properly stake out Rosie so the horse could graze but not wander. On the third day, they crossed into Wyoming territory, fording the Cheyenne River at a shallow point where the water ran clear over smooth stones. Maggie gasped at the cold when Rosie stepped into the current, soaking her skirts, but she laughed too, a sound of pure delight that made Jackson grin. "First time I have felt clean in days," she said when they reached the far bank, and Jackson realized she was right. They were both dusty and trail-worn, their clothes stiff with sweat and dirt. "There is a town about 10 miles west of here," Jackson said. "Small place, but it will have a hotel. What would you say to a real bed tonight and maybe a bath?" "I would say you are a miracle worker," Maggie said, and her smile was bright enough to rival the sun. The town was called Pine Ridge, a collection of wooden buildings that hugged the base of a rocky outcrop. It was smaller than Deadwood, quieter, the kind of place where people minded their own business. Jackson liked it immediately. They rode in as the sun was setting, drawing a few curious looks but no hostility. Jackson found the hotel, a 2-story building with a faded sign that creaked in the wind, and paid for 2 rooms. The proprietor, a weathered woman with kind eyes, showed them upstairs. "Bathhouse is out back," she said. "Water is extra, but it is hot. Dining room serves supper until 8. Maggie disappeared into her room, and Jackson heard her delighted gasp through the thin walls when she saw the actual bed with actual sheets. He grinned and went to arrange for baths for both of them. An hour later, scrubbed clean and wearing his spare shirt, Jackson felt almost human again. He knocked on Maggie's door, and when she answered, he barely recognized her. She had washed her hair, and it fell in soft waves around her face, no longer tangled and dusty. She had also washed her dress as best she could, though the bloodstains still showed faintly. But it was her face that struck him. The bruise had faded to yellow and green, still visible but healing, and without the mask of fear and dirt, she was lovely. Her eyes were bright, her smile genuine. "I feel like a new person," she said. "You look like one," Jackson said, and then felt his face heat because that had sounded more forward than he had intended. But Maggie just laughed. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. The bath, the room, all of it. I know this is costing you money." "I have got money," Jackson said. "And besides, you are worth it." They went down to the dining room, where the proprietor served them stew and fresh bread and apple pie that tasted like heaven after days of trail rations. They talked while they ate, really talked for the first time. Maggie told him about her childhood in Illinois, about her father's farm and his dreams of something bigger. She told him about her mother, who had died of fever when Maggie was 10, and how she had kept house for her father after that, learning to cook and sew and manage on very little. Jackson told her about his own past, about growing up in Texas with a father who drank too much and a mother who finally found the courage to leave when Jackson was 12. He told her about working his first cattle drive at 15, about learning the hard way how to survive on the frontier. He told her about the places he had seen, the people he had met, the good and the bad of a life spent moving from place to place. "You ever want to settle down?" Maggie asked, sipping coffee after her pie was gone. "Find a place to call home." "Sometimes," Jackson admitted. "But I have never found the right place, or maybe the right reason." Their eyes met across the table and something passed between them, a spark of understanding or connection or something deeper. Maggie looked away first, her cheeks coloring, and Jackson cleared his throat. "What about you?" he asked. "What do you want when you think about the future?" "I want to feel safe," Maggie said immediately. "I want to be able to walk down a street without being afraid. I want work that I am proud of, that does not make me feel ashamed. And someday, maybe, I want a family, children. A home that is truly mine." She paused, then added quietly, "I want to feel like I matter to someone." "You matter," Jackson said, and he meant it with an intensity that surprised him. "You matter to me." Maggie looked up, her eyes searching his face. "Why, you barely know me." "I know enough," Jackson said. "I know you are brave and strong and kind. I know you deserve better than what life has given you so far. And I know that I am glad I found you behind that general store, because meeting you is the best thing that has happened to me in a long time." Maggie's eyes filled with tears again, but she was smiling. "You are a good man, Jackson Xavier. I am starting to believe that such men actually exist." They sat there for a while longer, talking until the proprietor started blowing out lamps and hinting that it was time for guests to retire. Jackson walked Maggie to her door, feeling absurdly like a schoolboy at his first dance. "Good night," Maggie said, her hand on the door frame, "and thank you. For today, for the bath and the meal, and just for being kind." "Good night, Maggie," Jackson said. On impulse, he reached out and squeezed her hand briefly, a gesture of comfort and connection. Her fingers tightened around his for just a moment before she pulled away and slipped into her room. Jackson lay awake in his own bed for a long time that night, staring at the ceiling and thinking about hazel eyes and the sound of laughter and the way Maggie's hand had felt in his. He was in trouble, he realized. He was starting to care about her, really care, in a way that went beyond simple protection or partnership. And that was dangerous, because Maggie had been through enough. She did not need him complicating her life with feelings she might not return, but his heart, it seemed, had other ideas. They stayed in Pine Ridge for 3 days, resting and recovering from the hard ride. Jackson found work helping a local rancher move some cattle, which put more money in his pocket. Maggie earned a few dollars doing laundry and mending for the hotel proprietor, who took a liking to her. It was good, Jackson thought, for both of them to feel useful, to be doing something normal after the chaos of their escape. On the evening of the 3rd day, they sat on the porch of the hotel, watching the sun set over the Wyoming plains. The sky was a riot of colors, orange and pink and deep purple, and the air was warm with the last heat of the day. "I have been thinking," Maggie said, her voice quiet, "about what you said, about traveling together, being partners." Jackson felt his heartbeat quicken but kept his voice steady. And I think I would like that," Maggie said. "If the offer is still open, you have kept every promise you made to me. You have been respectful and kind and honest. I trust you, Jackson. I do not trust easily anymore, but I trust you." Relief and something warmer flooded through Jackson. "The offer is still open, and I am glad you trust me. I will do my best to never give you reason to regret it." "Where do we go from here?" Maggie asked. "West," Jackson said. "There is ranch country out toward the Big Horn Mountains. I have heard they are always looking for hands out there, and the country is beautiful. We could find work, spend the summer there, see how things go." "That sounds good," Maggie said. She hesitated, then added, "I need to tell you something, though. I need you to understand. After what happened with Salter, I am not ready for anything romantic. I know you have been nothing but respectful, but I need to be clear. I need time to heal, to feel like myself again. Can you accept that?" "Of course," Jackson said immediately. "Maggie, I meant what I said. This partnership is whatever you want it to be. If all we ever are is friends, that is enough for me. Your healing, your comfort, those come first, always." Maggie smiled, and there was relief in her eyes. "Thank you. That means more than you know." They left Pine Ridge the next morning, heading west into the sunrise. The landscape opened up before them, vast and beautiful, and for the first time since leaving Deadwood, Jackson felt like they could truly breathe. No one was chasing them. They were free. The days settled into a rhythm. They rode during the cooler hours of morning and evening, rested during the heat of midday. Maggie proved to be a quick learner, picking up the skills of trail life with impressive speed. She learned to start a fire in the wind, to cook over an open flame, to read weather signs in the clouds. Jackson taught her to shoot, spending an afternoon letting her practice with his rifle until she could hit a tin can at 20 paces. "You are a natural," he said, impressed, after she knocked the can off a rock with her 5th shot. "My father taught me a little," Maggie said, lowering the rifle. "He said every woman on the frontier should know how to defend herself. I had forgotten how much I enjoyed it." They talked endlessly as they traveled, sharing stories and dreams and fears. Jackson learned that Maggie loved to read, that she had brought one precious book with her from Illinois, a volume of poetry that had belonged to her mother. She learned that Jackson had a gift for music, that he carried a harmonica in his saddlebag and could coax beautiful melodies from it around the campfire. They learned each other's quirks and habits, the way Maggie hummed while she cooked, the way Jackson always checked his guns before sleeping, the way they both loved the quiet moments just after dawn when the world felt new and full of possibility. And slowly, carefully, they began to heal. Maggie's bruises faded completely, and the haunted look left her eyes. She laughed more, smiled more, relaxed in a way that told Jackson she was finally starting to feel safe. And Jackson, who had spent so many years wandering alone, found himself looking forward to each day in a way he never had before. Waking up to find Maggie already stirring the fire, riding with her light weight settled behind him on Rosie, talking with her under the stars, these became the best parts of his life. 3 weeks after leaving Pine Ridge, they reached the Big Horn Basin, a vast expanse of grassland nestled between mountain ranges. The grass was green from spring rains, and wildflowers dotted the landscape in splashes of color. It was some of the most beautiful country Jackson had ever seen. They found work at a ranch called the Broken Arrow, owned by a man named Thomas Kent. Kent was in his 50s, weathered and tough but fair, and he needed help with the summer work of branding and fence repair. He offered Jackson a job immediately and was happy to hire Maggie as a cook when Jackson explained she was his traveling partner. "We have got a bunkhouse for the hands," Kent said, "and a small cabin out past the barn that you two can use if you want privacy. It is not fancy, but it has got a stove and a decent roof." The cabin was small, just 2 rooms, but it was clean and dry and felt like a palace after weeks on the trail. Maggie took the bedroom, and Jackson made himself a bedroll on the floor of the main room, which also served as kitchen and living space. It was close quarters, but it felt right, comfortable, like they were building something together, even if neither of them could quite name what that something was. The work was hard but satisfying. Jackson spent his days in the saddle, riding the range with the other hands, moving cattle and mending fences and doing the 100 small tasks that kept a ranch running. Maggie cooked for the crew, and her meals became legendary. She could make beans and salt pork taste like a feast, and her biscuits were so good that the ranch hands started competing to see who could get to the table first. On Sundays, the one day of rest, Jackson and Maggie would take Rosie and ride out into the surrounding country. They explored creek beds and climbed hills and sat in the shade of cottonwood trees, talking or sometimes just being quiet together. It was on one of those Sundays, nearly 2 months after they had arrived at the Broken Arrow, that something between them shifted. They had ridden to a high meadow filled with lupines, the purple flowers so thick they looked like a lake. Maggie had dismounted and was walking through the flowers, her face turned up to the sun, and Jackson was watching her with an expression he could not quite hide. She looked happy, truly happy, and he realized that somewhere along the way her happiness had become the most important thing in his world. Maggie turned and caught him staring. "What?" she asked, smiling. "Nothing," Jackson said, dismounting. "Just thinking." "About what?" He should have lied, should have said something easy and meaningless. But Jackson had never been good at lying, and he found he did not want to start now. "About how glad I am that I found you," he said. "About how much better my life has been since that day in Deadwood." Maggie walked back toward him, moving through the flowers like she was wading through water. "My life is better too," she said softly. "You saved me, Jackson, not just from Salter but from giving up, from believing that the world was nothing but cruelty and pain. You showed me that there are still good people, still kindness and beauty and hope." They were standing very close now, close enough that Jackson could see the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes, could smell the faint scent of wildflowers and sunshine that clung to her hair. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. "Maggie," he said, and his voice was rough. "I need to tell you something. I know I said this partnership could be whatever you wanted, and I meant that. But I also need you to know that my feelings for you have changed. I care about you more than I have ever cared about anyone. And if there is even a chance that you might feel the same way, I would like to explore that. But if you do not, if you just want to be friends, I will accept that. I will never push you. I just need you to know where I stand." Maggie was very still, her eyes searching his face. For a long moment she did not speak, and Jackson felt his heart sink. He had pushed too far, too fast. He had ruined everything. But then Maggie smiled, and it was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "I feel the same way," she said quietly. "I have been feeling it for weeks now, but I was too scared to say anything, too scared to believe it was real. Jackson, you have been so patient with me, so kind. You have never once made me feel pressured or afraid. You have just been there, steady and strong and true, and somewhere along the way I fell in love with you." Jackson felt like he could not breathe. "You mean that?" "I mean it," Maggie said. She reached up and touched his face, her hand gentle against his jaw. "I love you, Jackson Xavier. I love your kindness and your strength and the way you play the harmonica at night. I love how you always check on Rosie before you check on yourself. I love how you listen when I talk, and how you have never once tried to control me or tell me what to do. I love you, and I am not scared anymore." Jackson closed the distance between them and kissed her, soft and careful, giving her every chance to pull away. But Maggie did not pull away. She leaned into him, her arms coming up around his neck, and kissed him back with a sweetness that made his head spin. They stood there in the meadow of purple flowers, holding each other, and Jackson felt something inside him finally settle. This was what he had been searching for all those years on the trail. This was home. From that day forward, things were different between them. Not drastically, but in small, important ways. They held hands when they walked. Jackson would kiss Maggie's forehead when he left for work in the morning and her lips when he returned in the evening. They talked about the future, not in vague terms but in concrete plans. They would work through the summer and fall, save their money, and then look for a piece of land of their own. A small ranch, maybe, or a homestead. Somewhere they could build a life together. Thomas Kent noticed the change and approved. "You are good for each other," he said to Jackson one day while they were working on a corral fence. "I can see it. You are steady together, like you were meant to be a pair." "She is the best thing that ever happened to me," Jackson said simply. "Then do not let her go," Kent said. "Good women are rare out here. When you find one, you hold on." "I plan to," Jackson said. Summer turned to fall and the aspens in the mountains turned gold. The work continued, preparing for winter, moving cattle to lower pastures, stocking up on supplies. Jackson and Maggie continued to live in the little cabin, and it began to feel like a real home. Maggie put up curtains she had sewn from flour sacks. Jackson built a bench for the porch. They were building a life, piece by piece. It was in late October, when the first snow was starting to dust the mountain peaks, that Jackson asked Maggie to marry him. He had been planning it for weeks, trying to figure out the right way to do it. He was not a man of fancy words or grand gestures, so in the end, he kept it simple. They were sitting on the porch bench watching the sunset, wrapped in a shared blanket against the evening chill. The sky was streaked with red and orange, and the air smelled like wood smoke and coming winter. "Maggie," Jackson said, taking her hand. "We have been together for 6 months now. 6 of the best months of my life. And I know that is not very long by some standards. But out here, on the frontier, you learn quick what matters and what does not. And I know that you matter. I know that I want to spend every day of the rest of my life with you. I know that I want to build a home with you, raise children with you, grow old with you. So I am asking, plain and simple, will you marry me?" Maggie's eyes were shining with tears, but she was smiling. "Yes," she said. "Yes, of course, yes." Jackson pulled a ring from his pocket. It was simple, a thin gold band that he had bought from a traveling peddler who had come through the ranch the week before. It was not fancy, but it was real gold, and it represented everything he had to offer. His heart, his loyalty, his future. He slipped it onto Maggie's finger, and she held her hand up to catch the last light of the sunset, watching the way the gold glowed. "It is perfect," she said. "You are perfect." "I am far from perfect," Jackson said with a laugh. "But I will spend the rest of my life trying to be the man you deserve." They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the ranch. Thomas Kent stood as witness, along with some of the other ranch hands who had become friends. There was no preacher available, so Kent, who was also a justice of the peace, performed the ceremony himself. It was simple and short, held in the ranch house with a fire crackling in the hearth and snow falling gently outside the windows. Maggie wore a dress she had made from fabric she had bought in town, a soft blue color that matched the Wyoming sky. Jackson wore his best shirt and pants, his hair slicked back and his face clean-shaven. When Kent pronounced them husband and wife, Jackson kissed Maggie with all the love and promise in his heart, and the assembled guests cheered. The celebration afterward was small but joyful. Maggie had made a cake, and there was whiskey and music. One of the ranch hands played fiddle, and Jackson danced with his wife, spinning her around the small room while everyone clapped and laughed. It was not a fancy wedding by any means, but it was real and filled with love. And that was all that mattered. That night, in the privacy of their little cabin, Jackson and Maggie became husband and wife in every sense. It was tender and gentle, Jackson being careful with her, remembering her past trauma, making sure she felt safe and loved. And Maggie, who had been so scared and broken just months ago, gave herself to him freely and joyfully, trusting him completely. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the small bed, the quilt pulled up against the cold, and talked in whispers about the future. "I want at least 3 children," Maggie said, her head on Jackson's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "3 sounds good," Jackson agreed. "What else?" "A garden," Maggie said. "A big one with vegetables and flowers and chickens. I have always wanted chickens." "Chickens are easy," Jackson said. "What else?" Maggie said, lifting her head to look at him. "That is all I really need. As long as I have you, I have everything." Jackson kissed her soft and slow. "You have got me," he promised, "for as long as we both shall live." They spent the winter at the Broken Arrow, working and saving money. Jackson helped with the winter feeding and maintenance, and Maggie continued to cook for the crew. They were popular with the other ranch hands, known for their kindness and their obvious love for each other. It was a good winter, peaceful and productive, and by the time spring rolled around, they had saved enough money to start looking for land of their own. Thomas Kent was sorry to see them go, but understood their desire to build something of their own. "You have both been good workers," he said, shaking Jackson's hand on their last day. "And if you ever need anything, you know where to find me." "We appreciate everything you have done for us," Jackson said. "You gave us a chance when we needed it, and we will not forget that." They left the Broken Arrow in early May of 1879, exactly 1 year after Jackson had found Maggie crying behind the general store in Deadwood. They rode Rosie, who was now older but still strong, and led a pack horse loaded with their possessions and supplies. They headed west into the mountains, looking for the perfect spot to claim as their own. They found it 3 weeks later, a valley nestled in the foothills of the Big Horn Mountains. There was a creek running through it, clear and cold, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above. The valley was sheltered from the worst winds, and the soil looked rich. Best of all, it was unclaimed, free for the taking under the Homestead Act. "This is it," Maggie said, dismounting and walking through the meadow grass. "This is our home." Jackson looked around, seeing it through her eyes. He could picture a cabin there, beside the creek, a barn over there for horses and cattle, a garden closer to the cabin where Maggie could grow her vegetables, corrals and outbuildings, and eventually, maybe a bigger house when they could afford it. He could see it all, their future laid out before them. "Then let us get started," he said. They worked through the spring and summer, building their homestead from nothing. Jackson felled trees and shaped them into logs for a cabin. Maggie helped, her hands blistering and then toughening as she learned to use an axe and a saw. They worked from dawn until dark, stopping only to eat and sleep, driven by the vision of what they were creating. By late summer, the cabin was finished. It was small, just 1 room with a sleeping loft, but it was solid and well built. Jackson had made a door that closed tight and windows that could be shuttered against storms. He had built a stone fireplace that drew cleanly and a chimney that did not smoke. Maggie had sewn curtains and made a mattress from prairie grass covered with fabric. They had built a table and chairs, and Jackson had carved their initials into the door frame. The day they moved into the cabin, Maggie stood in the doorway and cried. But these were tears of joy, of accomplishment, of finally having a place that was truly theirs. "We did it," she said, wiping at her eyes. "We really did it." "We did," Jackson agreed, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "This is our home, Maggie, ours. No one can take it from us." They spent their first night in the cabin wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the creek outside and the wind in the pines. It was perfect. Over the next year, they continued to build their homestead. Jackson put up a barn and corrals. He bought cattle from a nearby rancher, just a few head to start, but it was a beginning. Maggie planted her garden and it thrived in the rich soil, giving them beans and squash and potatoes and more tomatoes than they could eat. She got her chickens, a noisy flock that provided eggs and entertainment. They worked hard, but they also found time for joy, for evening walks along the creek, for Sunday rides into the mountains, for making love in their little cabin with the door barred against the world. In the spring of 1880, Maggie told Jackson she was pregnant. They had been hoping for it, trying for it, but when it finally happened, Jackson felt a wave of emotion so strong it nearly knocked him over. They were going to have a baby. They were going to be a family. "Are you happy?" Maggie asked, suddenly anxious. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Jackson said, pulling her close. "I am terrified and excited and more in love with you than I thought possible. We are going to have a baby, Maggie. We are going to be parents." Maggie laughed and cried at the same time. "We are," she said, "and they are going to have the best father in the world." The pregnancy was not easy. Maggie was sick for the first few months, and Jackson hovered over her like a nervous hen, trying to make her comfortable. But as the summer progressed, she began to feel better, and her belly swelled with the growing child. Jackson would lie with his hand on her stomach at night, feeling the baby kick, and he would talk to the child, telling stories and making promises. "I promise I will always protect you," he would say. "I promise I will teach you everything I know. I promise I will love your mother every day of my life, so you grow up seeing what real love looks like." Their son was born in late October, during the first snowstorm of the year. It was a long, difficult labor, and there was no doctor for miles. Jackson had ridden to get the nearest woman with midwife experience, a homesteader's wife named Ruth who lived 10 miles away. Ruth had come immediately, and she had guided Maggie through the birth with calm competence while Jackson paced and prayed and held Maggie's hand when she needed him. When the baby finally arrived, squalling and red-faced and perfect, Jackson felt tears streaming down his face. Ruth placed the baby in Maggie's arms and Jackson knelt beside the bed, looking at his wife and his son, and he felt like his heart might burst from the fullness of it. "What should we name him?" Maggie asked, her voice weak but happy. Jackson thought about it. "James," he said. "After my grandfather. He was a good man, a kind man. I would like our son to carry his name." "James Xavier," Maggie said, testing the name. "I like it. Hello, James. Welcome to the world." Little James thrived, growing strong and healthy through that first winter. Jackson and Maggie adjusted to the rhythms of parenthood, the sleepless nights and the constant worry and the overwhelming love that came with having a child. Maggie was a natural mother, patient and loving, and Jackson discovered he had a talent for soothing a crying baby, walking the floor with James on his shoulder, humming old trail songs. The years that followed were good ones. The homestead prospered. Jackson's cattle herd grew, and he was able to buy more land, expanding their holdings. Maggie's garden became famous in the area, and she started selling vegetables and preserves to nearby homesteaders. They were not rich, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. 2 years after James was born, Maggie had their second child, a daughter they named Sarah. She had Maggie's hazel eyes and Jackson's dark hair, and she was doted on by her older brother from the moment she arrived. 3 years after Sarah came another boy, whom they named Thomas after the rancher who had given them their start. And 2 years after that, Maggie gave birth to twin girls, Emily and Grace, who kept the entire household in chaos with their energy and mischief. The little cabin was far too small for their growing family, so Jackson built a proper house. 2 stories with 4 bedrooms and a big kitchen where Maggie could cook and the children could do their lessons. He built a porch that wrapped around 3 sides where they could sit on summer evenings and watch the sun set over the mountains. It took him 3 years, working in his spare time, but when it was finished, it was beautiful. A real home for their family. The children grew, learning the ways of the homestead. James became his father's shadow, learning to ride and rope and handle cattle. Sarah had her mother's gift for growing things, and she took over much of the garden work. Thomas was quieter, more thoughtful, and he showed an early talent for working with wood, carving beautiful things from scraps. The twins were wild and joyful, always into some adventure or another, keeping everyone on their toes. Through it all, Jackson and Maggie's love only deepened. They had been through so much together, built so much together, that they were no longer just husband and wife. They were partners in the truest sense, each one completing the other. Jackson still remembered the day he had found her crying behind the general store, remembered the fear in her eyes and the desperate courage it had taken for her to trust him. And he thanked God every day that he had been in the right place at the right time, that he had been given the chance to save her, and in doing so, to save himself. They aged together, their hair going gray, their faces lining with years of sun and wind and laughter. The homestead became a ranch, one of the most prosperous in the region. Their children grew and eventually started families of their own. James married a schoolteacher and took over much of the ranch work. Sarah married a neighboring rancher's son. Thomas moved to town and opened a carpentry shop. The twins both married brothers from a nearby homestead and stayed close to home. And through it all, Jackson and Maggie remained at the center, the heart of their growing family. They became grandparents, then great-grandparents, their small cabin in the valley having given rise to a dynasty of sorts. The ranch that had started with nothing but dreams and hard work now employed dozens of people and covered thousands of acres. But the best moments, the ones Jackson treasured most, were still the quiet ones. Sitting on the porch with Maggie in the evenings, her hand in his, watching the sun set over the mountains that had witnessed their entire life together. Those moments when it was just the two of them, and he could look at her and still see the frightened young woman he had found in Deadwood, and the brave soul who had chosen to trust him, and the partner who had built a life with him, and the love of his life who had made every day better just by being in it. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch to celebrate. There was a feast and music and dancing, and at the end of the evening, Jackson and Maggie stood together on the porch, looking out at the land they had built, the family they had raised, the legacy they had created. "You ever think about that day in Deadwood?" Maggie asked softly. "About how different our lives would have been if you had not found me." "I think about it sometimes," Jackson admitted, "but I try not to dwell on it because it did not happen that way. I did find you. You did trust me, and we did build this life together. That is what matters." "Do you have any regrets?" Maggie asked. Jackson thought about it seriously because Maggie deserved a real answer. He thought about all the hard times, the struggles and the setbacks and the moments of doubt. He thought about the children they had buried, 2 babies who had not survived past infancy, losses that had nearly broken them. He thought about the bad years when drought or harsh winters had threatened their livelihood. He thought about all of it, the good and the bad, the joy and the sorrow. "No," he said finally, "I have no regrets. Every single moment, even the hard ones, brought us here. Brought us to this life, this family, this love. How could I regret any of that?" Maggie leaned her head against his shoulder. I love you, Jackson Xavier. I have loved you from the moment you offered me your hand and told me to cry my last tear. You have been my hero, my partner, my best friend, and the love of my life. Thank you for finding me. Thank you for saving me. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for letting me, Jackson said, kissing the top of her head. Thank you for being brave enough to come with me that night. Thank you for building this life with me. Thank you for our children, our family, for every moment we have had together. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Maggie. Then, now, and always. They stood there together, wrapped in each other's arms as the last light faded from the sky and the stars began to appear. Inside the house, they could hear their family laughing and talking, the sound of life and love and legacy. It was everything Jackson had ever wanted, more than he had ever dreamed possible. And it had all started with a woman crying behind a general store and a cowboy who offered her a way out. One moment of courage, one choice to trust, and from that, an entire life had grown. A love story written across the harsh landscape of the frontier, proof that even in the wildest places, even in the hardest times, love could take root and flourish and create something beautiful. As they grew older still, into their 60s and then 70s, Jackson and Maggie slowed down but never stopped. They passed the day-to-day running of the ranch to James and his sons, but they remained active, helping where they could, always present at family gatherings, always ready with advice or stories or just a listening ear. They had become the matriarch and patriarch of a sprawling family, loved and respected by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren alike. Jackson's hair turned completely white, and his hands, once so strong and quick with a rope or a rifle, became gnarled with arthritis. But Maggie still held those hands every day, still kissed him good morning and good night, still looked at him with the same love that had been there from the beginning. Maggie's own hair had gone silver, and the years had softened her figure, but to Jackson, she was as beautiful as the day he had first really seen her, cleaned up and hopeful in that hotel in Pine Ridge. They celebrated their 40th anniversary, then their 45th. The ranch continued to prosper under James's management, growing and adapting to the changing times. The West was tamer now than it had been in their youth. Railroads crisscrossed the landscape, towns had grown into cities, and the wild frontier was becoming something more settled and civilized. But on their ranch in their valley, something of the Old West remained. The values of hard work and family and loyalty, the connection to the land and the animals, the understanding that life was precious and should be lived fully. One evening in early autumn, when Jackson was 78 and Maggie 77, they took a walk down to the creek, moving slowly but still hand in hand. The aspens were turning gold again, as they did every year, and the air had that crisp quality that spoke of coming winter. They sat on a bench that Jackson had built years ago, watching the water flow past, listening to the sounds of the ranch behind them. "Do you remember what you said to me?" Maggie asked. "That first day when you found me." "I remember," Jackson said. "I told you to cry your last tear and come with me." "Best advice anyone ever gave me," Maggie said with a smile. "I did cry my last tear that day. Oh, I have cried since, tears of joy and sorrow and everything in between, but I have never again cried the way I was crying that day. I have never again felt that kind of hopelessness, that kind of despair. You took that away. You gave me hope. You gave me purpose," Jackson said. "Before I met you, I was just drifting, going from job to job, place to place, never really belonging anywhere. You gave me a reason to put down roots. You made me want to build something that would last." "We built it together," Maggie said. "We did," Jackson agreed. "And it is a good life, Maggie, a really good life." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink lower, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Jackson felt Maggie's weight against his side, felt the steady rhythm of her breathing, and he felt a peace so profound it was almost painful in its sweetness. "I am tired," Maggie said softly, and there was something in her voice that made Jackson's heart clench. "Then we should get you back to the house," he said, starting to rise. But Maggie stopped him with a hand on his arm. "Not that kind of tired," she said. "I mean I am tired in my bones, Jackson. Tired in the way that means I have lived a long, full life and I am ready to rest." Jackson felt tears prick his eyes. They had both been healthy for their age, but lately, Maggie had been slowing down more, sleeping more, eating less. The doctor in town had examined her and found nothing specific, but he had taken Jackson aside and said quietly that sometimes, when people reached a certain age, their bodies just decided it was time. "Do not talk like that," Jackson said, even though he knew it was futile. "You have got years left in you yet." "Maybe," Maggie said, "or maybe not. Either way, I need you to know something. I need you to know that I have been happy, Jackson, so deeply, completely happy. You gave me that. This life, this family, this love, all of it has been more than I ever dreamed possible. So when my time comes, whether that is tomorrow or 10 years from now, I want you to remember that I died happy. I died loved, and that is a precious gift." Jackson pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, breathing in her scent. "I cannot imagine this world without you in it." "You will not have to imagine for a while yet," Maggie said, patting his chest. "I am not going anywhere tonight. But when I do, you have to promise me you will keep living, keep loving our family, keep telling our story. Promise me, Jackson." "I promise," Jackson said, his voice breaking. "But only if you promise to fight. Do not give up on me, Maggie, not yet." "I promise," Maggie said. "I will fight as long as I can. But when I cannot fight anymore, you have to let me go. You have to know that it is okay. Can you do that for me?" "I can try," Jackson said, "but it will be the hardest thing I have ever done." "I know," Maggie said, "but you are the strongest man I have ever known. You will get through it, and you will know that I loved you every single day of our life together. You will know that meeting you, trusting you, loving you was the best thing I ever did." They sat there until the stars came out, holding each other, saying without words all the things that needed to be said. And when they finally walked back to the house, it was slowly, savoring each step, each moment they still had together. Maggie lived for 2 more years, and they were good years, filled with family and laughter and love. She got to meet more great-grandchildren, got to see James's oldest son take over more of the ranch work, got to celebrate one more anniversary with Jackson. And when she finally passed, in her sleep on a warm summer night with Jackson holding her hand, it was peaceful. She simply drifted away, a smile on her face, as if she was walking into some beautiful place that only she could see. The grief nearly destroyed Jackson. For the first time in his life, he felt truly lost. Maggie had been his North Star, his anchor, his reason for everything. Without her, the world felt gray and empty. But he remembered his promise. He remembered telling her he would keep living, keep loving their family, keep telling their story. So he did. He moved into the big house with James and his family, unable to bear the silence of the home he had shared with Maggie. He spent his days with his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling them stories of the old days, of the frontier, of the cattle drives and the homesteading. And he told them about Maggie, about the brave young woman he had found crying behind a general store, about how she had trusted him enough to ride away into the night, about how they had built a life and a family, and a love that had lasted over 50 years. The children loved the stories, and Jackson loved telling them. It kept Maggie alive in a way, kept her spirit present in the family she had helped create. And slowly, over time, the raw grief softened into something gentler. Not absence, but presence. The sense that Maggie was still with him, in the land they had claimed, in the house they had built, in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their blood and their legacy. Jackson lived to be 83, long enough to see the new century arrive, long enough to see automobiles start to appear on the roads and electricity reach even their remote valley. He saw the world change in ways he could never have imagined when he was young, but the things that mattered, love and family and integrity, those things remained the same. On a cold winter morning in January of 1903, Jackson Xavier passed away peacefully in his sleep. His children found him in his bed, his face peaceful, his hands folded on his chest. On the table beside the bed was a photograph of Maggie, taken on their 25th anniversary, her face forever young and smiling. And on his finger was his wedding band, the mate to the simple gold ring he had given Maggie all those years ago. They buried him next to Maggie on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a stone that bore both their names and a simple inscription that James had chosen. Together they built a life. Together they built a love. Together they rest. The family gathered for the funeral, dozens of people whose very existence was a testament to that day in Deadwood when a cowboy offered a crying woman a chance at a new life. They told stories and shared memories, and they remembered the love story that had started it all. And in the years that followed, the story of Jackson and Maggie became a family legend, passed down through the generations. The story of how a frightened young woman and a compassionate cowboy had found each other in the wildest part of the American frontier and built something that lasted. A love that survived hardship and tragedy, that grew stronger with each passing year, that created a legacy of family and love that would endure long after they were gone. Their ranch still operates today, run by their descendants, who still tell the story of Jackson and Maggie, who still remember the day a cowboy saw a woman crying behind a general store and said, "Cry your last tear, then come with me," who still believe in the power of compassion and courage and love to change lives and create miracles, because that is what Jackson and Maggie were, a miracle. Two people who found each other in the wilderness and created something beautiful. A love story for the ages, written on the hard land of the American West, proof that even in the harshest conditions, love can not only survive but thrive and create a legacy that will never be forgotten.